In recent days, the West Philippine Sea disputes within the broader South China Sea Basin have once again dominated the headlines. There are growing concerns of potential conflict between the Philippines and China, which could eventually drag in the United States and spark a great power conflict. But in order to understand how we arrive at this point in history, we have to look at the roots of the conflict. Particularly, how did the disputes between the Philippines and China start? To better understand these issues, we will talk to someone who has been analyzing and at the same time close to policymakers in terms of dealing with the threats from China to Philippine claims in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea in the past decades, especially since the end of Cold War. In particular, we'll discuss the Mischief Reef crisis in the early to mid 1990s. Then we'll discuss the Scarborough Shoal and how different Filipino administrations have dealt with threats from China throughout the decades. Today, we're joined by former Associate Justice Antonio Carpio to discuss the latest in the West Philippine Sea and what are the challenges and opportunities ahead for the country. Thank you very much, Justice, for joining us.
Thank you, Richard, for inviting me.
As always, there's a lot to discuss, but before we go into assessment of the Marcos administration's response to the West Philippine Sea disputes, can you just quickly remind everyone how did you get so involved in the West Philippine Sea issues? Because I mean, you were a former associate justice.
Well, I was the Chief Presidential Legal Counsel of former President Fidel V. Ramos. I was in Malacanang when China seized Mischief Reef in 1995, end of 1995, early 1996. And we really didn't know what to do. At that time, we had ratified UNCLOS, but China had not ratified UNCLOS, so we could not sue China before an UNCLOS tribunal. And of course, we kicked out the Americans just 2 years before that. So the Americans were not around anymore. So we had to face China alone. And of course, when the Americans left, there was a power vacuum in the South China Sea. And whenever there is a power vacuum, the next power will come in, will rush in. And that's why China seized Mischief Reef soon after the Americans left. And we couldn't do anything. China seized Mischief Reef, part of our exclusive economic zone. We couldn't do anything. We sent an old Philippine Navy ship to bring local and foreign journalists to Mischief Reef, and the ship conked out before reaching Mischief Reef. So it was really very sad. I mean, we didn't know what to do. We couldn't go to an UNCLOS tribunal because China had not yet ratified. And it became a fait accompli. Of course, we went to the ASEAN, and ASEAN, we were able to convince them to come out with the ASEAN-China DOC, the Declaration of Conduct, that from 2002 onwards, everybody we will freeze. In other words, no new occupation of unoccupied features. If you are there already, you stay there. Do not expand your occupation. And that is the Declaration of Conduct. Of course, the Declaration of Conduct says the parties will enter into a code of conduct to manage the dispute, not to settle the dispute, but to manage the dispute so there will be no shooting war, because the settlement of the dispute will be UNCLOS. But to manage the dispute, we need to talk to the parties so we don't have a shooting war at sea. So for me, it was really an eye-opener that China could just grab our exclusive economic zone. So that left an indelible mark in my mind, how to counter China. And it percolated in my mind until a case was brought before the Supreme Court, and I happened to be there. That was the baselines law. It was being questioned. Congress passed the baselines law to align our baselines with UNCLOS, but some of our intellectuals in UP wanted the Treaty of Paris lines to be our baseline.
Right.
Of course, the Treaty of Paris lines, if we adopt it as our baselines, it will be like the 9-dash line. That's no support under international law. It's a figment of our imagination. And even the U.S. and Spain, who were parties to the Treaty of Paris, would not support us.
Right.
Uh, so that's where I started. So I said, we have to bring China to an UNCLOS tribunal to strike down the Nine Dash Line. But before we can do that, we have to put our house in order by uh, amending our baselines to conform with UNCLOS, because there is a principle in international law as well as in domestic law. Who he comes to court must come with clean hands. In other words, if we go to an UNCLOS tribunal and point to the Nine Dash Line as contrary to UNCLOS, China will point also to our treaty lines, Paris Treaty
Right.
Line as concrete to UNCLOS. So the case will be dismissed because you have to go to court with clean hands.
Right.
So I said, that's why I said, this is our opportunity to put our house in order, to align our baselines with UNCLOS, and we are prepared. After that, we'll be prepared to sue China. And in fact, I said, put it there in my ponencia that we need this to 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 claim our maritime zones under UNCLOS.
Justice, before we talk about the next, I would call it psychic wound, because in a way you're saying the Mischief Reef loss was really a shock, a strategic shock, a psychological shock, because it reminded us of our extreme vulnerability. I just wonder, I mean, we're talking about President Ramos, someone who's extremely adept in matters of defense and foreign affairs. Um, didn't we anticipate this in a way, or wasn't it more not a lack of anticipation, but lack of capacity to do something about the anticipation of China moving in? Because, you know, the idea of China filling in the vacuum was not totally crazy, right? By this time, years after the American bases were closed down.
Yes, I think, well, I cannot blame our senators for not ratifying the proposed new agreement on bases, extending
Right.
it. But they should have foreseen
Mm.
that once the U.S. leaves the Philippines, leaves Subic and Clark, there will be a vacuum in the South China Sea, and that would be the time for China to come in. We should have prepared for that. I mean, before we kick out our allies from the air bases and naval bases in the Philippines, we should see what are the repercussions. Of course, naturally, China would come in. We should have prepared. We should have prepared our Navy for that. But we did not. That was the failure on the part of our policymakers, failure on the part of the Senate at the time, because they decided to not to renew the basis agreement. Then they should look at the repercussions, because that involved security. They did not. They just terminated and just
Yeah.
uh, jump with joy that they have done it, but they did not think far ahead that China would move in because there would be a power vacuum, and China continued. So that happened in 1995, 1996. We did not learn our lesson. We still did not prepare. We did not uh, strengthen our Navy or Air Force. We did not put radars there or anti-ship missiles. So China moved again in 2012, seized the Scarborough Shoal. And that was the wake-up call. I mean, when China seized Scarborough Shoal in 2012, that was the time when we realized that China will keep on grabbing
Right.
our maritime zones and island territories if they fall within the Nine Dash Line. That was the only time when we really realized that.
And Justice, I mean, I see your point, which is this tendency for us to try to go from zero to hero, right? Like, oh, we're gonna go for independence, and there's an element of strategic naivety there, because we live in a world whereby they're not, you know, they're gonna be driven by our sentiments. It's gonna be about the hard facts on the ground. Do you think that perhaps there should have been an interim measure? Because the idea of the Philippines suddenly building up its naval capacity, everyone knows we cannot do that in 2 to 3 years, right? Or even 5 years for that matter. Perhaps in retrospect, should there have been an interim measure of course, let's get rid of the American bases, but let's not go to zero suddenly out of what
Yes,
we had in Cold War period.
yes, we should have prepared for it, because the moment you remove the American bases, there's a power vacuum. We should have prepared for it. We should have anticipated that China would move in, because China started moving in the Spratlys in 1987.
Exactly, yeah.
In 1987, they
In Fiery
occupied the
Cross, yeah.
Fiery Cross Reef and
Exactly.
said that we're just putting a weather station here to help UNESCO in its global oceanic survey. That Fiery Cross Reef now is an air and naval base. I mean, that should have alarmed us already, but we did not. We thought that it didn't matter. I mean, we were lulled into complacency because, of course, we opened up to China. We traded with China, but China has a plan to make the Nine Dash Line its national boundary, and
Right.
that plan started way back in 1949 when the communists took over, and they waited for the time when their navy would be very strong, and when their navy became very strong, that's when they moved. But we never prepared for this. Well, we cannot also blame our military because they were worried about the internal
Yes, exactly, yeah.
insurgency. But we should have prepared for it. I think the nation should think far ahead, even while we are trying to put down the local insurgency. We should look at what are the external factors that could cause us to lose our island territories in the West Philippine Sea. But there was little thinking about that. We just didn't prepare for it. But the signs were very obvious
Exactly.
because in 1987, China seized Mischief Reef, China seized Fiery Cross Reef. 1988, they seized Subi Reef.
Right, from the Vietnamese.
Yeah, no,
I'm sorry, from the
from
Philippines,
the
and then yeah,
Philippines,
yeah.
and they seized from the Vietnamese.
Johnson South Reef, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Johnson South Reef. So it was there. It was, but we did not react. We did not prepare until 1995. We did not even prepare when China seized Mischief. It was the turning point was really Scarborough Shoal.
Right. And it's not like we didn't try to find a kind of a legalistic or political arrangement with China. If you look at the Arroyo administration, there was the JMSU, Joint Maritime Seismic Undertaking. There was all sorts of different projects that this administration was pursuing. Shouldn't that also have served as a kind of a wake up call about limits of diplomacy with China? That
Well, uh, the the JMSU was really graph ridden
mm,
because uh, I know the history. Uh, the Chinese offered to give us a huge loan for the North Rail, for the national broadband,
yeah, NBNZT. Yeah.
but they demanded that we sign the JMSU.
So there was a quid pro quo,
Yeah,
really,
that
there.
was the quid pro quo because the JMSU would allow them to survey even our territorial sea, include part of the territorial sea, which is crazy.
Wow,
So that's
that bad,
why
yeah.
when they surveyed the Reed Bank, they knew that there's a lot of gas in Reed Bank. That's why they didn't want us to go to Reed Bank. That they learned about the gas in Reed Bank in that JMSU survey. So that JMSU was supposed to be tripartite with Vietnam.
Vietnam, yeah.
The Chinese would survey with their equipment, Reed Bank, and the rest of the area, and the data would be given to us. We will interpret the data. But when they handed to us the data, when it came to Reed Bank, it was garbled. We couldn't
Oh, wow.
make anything out of the data. So it was really we were fooled there.
And we were fooled willfully, or we were fooled because of our naivete, or both,
Well, because we wanted to get
the investment.
the loan, the jumbo
Yes.
loan, supposed to be for the national broadband, which was, you know,
Itself drenched in
co-
corruption and all, yeah.
and the North Rail, which because of corruption,
The Supreme Court, yeah,
it
yeah.
was not finished,
Yeah.
and we had to terminate it, and China sued us in Hong Kong for arbitration, and we have to give back. We have to pay China for everything.
Right.
So, but if you look at North Rail, you can see those posts there. Nothing, not
Yeah.
even a meter of railroad was built. only those posts, because the mobilization fee was pocketed by someone, and
Right.
the Chinese demanded more mobilization, but our COA refused. No, so it was really graft-ridden,
Right.
and that was the demand of, the Chinese said, we'll give you that loan, but you sign the JMSU.
Right. So this was so, so the rot was at the core of the apple of
Yes.
diplomatic engagement with China. I think this is very important to establish because either you hear denial from pro-China quarters, or they'll say, "Why are you blaming us? Blame your own politicians. We just had to deal with the reality of political economy in the Philippines." But what you're saying is that maybe there was definitely corruption on the part of the Philippines, but the whole deal in itself was shady, to put it
Yeah,
nicely.
the
Yeah.
whole deal was shady because
Yeah.
our politicians wanted to get the loan. The Chinese knew that our politicians were greedy, and they said sign the JMSU even if it was against our national interest, because
Yes.
they would be surveying our territorial sea. That's crazy.
Yeah. And our constitution, because
Yeah,
eventually the Philippine
yeah,
Supreme Court
and
would
it's our
come in. Yeah.
EEZ. I mean,
Yeah.
the Constitution says the state shall protect its marine wealth in its exclusive economic zone and reserve its use and enjoyment exclusively for Filipinos. Yet we allow the Chinese. Can you just imagine? We allow the Chinese to survey our exclusive economic zone for what? Now that they know that there's gas in Reed Bank, they will not allow us to go there anymore.
Yeah. So considering how some would use a certain word with letter T at the beginning, how problematic this deal was, we had a Supreme Court ruling on this way later on. But in terms of accountability, don't you think there should have been certain people held accountable
Well,
for negotiating and signing such agreement?
yes, there should be, but nobody, the ombudsman didn't do anything.
Mm. And that's where, again, we see problems with rule of law, even in the Philippines. But of course, the Scarborough Shoal happens in 2012. This is the second major shock, but I don't know, by the second time, it shouldn't be a shock anymore because you already had enough of shock in the past. What was your understanding of what happened in the Scarborough Shoal? Was it kind of an operational mistake? Was it just a confluence of unfortunate factors? What was going on there?
The Scarborough Shoal was a planned operation by China. It was carefully planned.
Mm.
Uh, when that happened when North Korea was launching a rocket, and we sent our ship BRP. Uh, I forgot the name
Del
now.
Pilar? No, not Del Pilar would be sent to
Yeah,
the Scarborough Shoal, right?
yeah, Del Pilar.
Del
It
Pilar,
was
right? Yeah.
sent there to monitor the
Trajectory
the,
of
the trajectory
yeah.
of the North Korean rocket. But when they move a little past Scarborough Shoal on the way to the north, uh, they found out that the rocket had been launched earlier, so they turned
Mm.
back. When they turned back, our fishermen in Scarborough Shoal radioed our Navy and Coast Guard that the Chinese were loading giant clams inside the lagoon.
Right.
So the only ship there was the BRP
Del Pilar, yeah.
Del Pilar. So
Gregory
it
Del Pilar,
was
yeah.
ordered to go to Scarborough Shoal. And but before we sent the BRP Gregorio Del Pilar there, the Navy sent a plane to reconnoiter the area to find out if there are Chinese naval ships
Right, over the horizon.
over the
Yeah.
horizon.
Yeah.
And that's a routine. Every time we send our Navy there, Coast Guard, there will be a air reconnaissance to find out if there are Chinese vessels around the area, and they did not find any. And so they said there are no Chinese vessels around, so proceed. When they proceeded, suddenly they were blocked by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. It turned out on post-mortem that the Chinese Coast Guards knew that we would be sending our
Reconnaissance.
reconnaissance planes.
Yeah.
They stayed out of sight. And when the reconnaissance plane left, they steamed towards the shoal, Scarborough Shoal, to block our Gregorio del Pilar. And that's how it happened. It was planned.
It was a setup. It was a
It was a
trap.
setup.
Yeah.
This is like what the Chinese did to the South Vietnamese in 1974 in the Battle of the
Paracels.
Paracels.
Yeah.
And the everybody thought that it was just an accident, but the Chinese veterans of that battle came out later in YouTube,
Proudly saying.
proudly saying that they prepared for it months and years ahead. They were planning to bait the South Vietnamese to go there, and then when the South Vietnamese came, they were prepared. They outnumbered immediately the South Vietnamese. This is exactly what happened in Scarborough Shoal. There was a bait. They loaded the giant clams. They knew that our uh, our fishermen there would radio the Navy and the Coast Guard, and they knew that uh, uh, we would be sending a ship
Yeah,
to monitor the North Korean launch. And I think they cooperated with the North Korean on the timing, so that by the time our ship arrived in that area, a little past Scarborough Shoal, the rocket would be out of sight already. So the Gregorio Pillar would go back, and that's the time when they showed their giant clams to our fishermen who radioed. And of course, they knew that being the only ship there, the Gregorio del Pilar would be sent. It was well planned.
Mm-hmm.
It was an operation, and I think the Navy had a most post-mortem on this already. So it was planned. It was really planned in the same way that the Battle of Paracels was planned by the Chinese years ahead. They were waiting for a time to implement it.
What was your sense about this? Because I remember early on, there were a lot of skepticism, including from some of the legal experts and people following this. They're wondering if this is the right way forward. Uh, and China, of course, made it very clear they're not going to participate. They're not going to comply. What was your understanding of the arbitration move from the very beginning? Was it a desperation move? Was it a strategic move?
Well, I was planning for an arbitration even before the Scarborough Shoal incident. That's why I wrote that decision in uh, upholding the baseline law.
As the Supreme Court
At
Justice,
the Supreme Court, because that happened in 2009. And 2012,
Right.
2 years later, this incident in Scarborough Shoal happened. So, because I believe that we could never lose if we go to an UNCLOS tribunal, because it's our EEZ, and China is so far away. And the Chinese baseline will have to start in Hainan. That's 800 nautical miles.
Right.
And under UNCLOS, the maximum you can claim is 350 nautical miles. So the only issue there was Ituaba, whether it was habitable or not. Because if Ituaba were habitable, then its EEZ would overlap with the EEZ of Palawan. And in 2006, China made a reservation that's allowed under UNCLOS that in case of overlapping EEZ, they would not be subject to compulsory arbitration, because China already foresaw that we would be bringing the issue to an UNCLOS tribunal. So they made that reservation. So we had to fight in the tribunal to argue that Ituaba is not habitable.
An island,
Yeah, and unfortunately, we had to fight our own Solicitor General at the time, because they didn't want us to discuss, but we won that battle internally. So the tribunal said the Ituaba is not habitable, but we had a fallback position. If the tribunal would say that it's not habitable, there's an overlap, then we would have gone to compulsory conciliation, which is what East Timor did in its battle with Australia, and East Timor won. It used the compulsory conciliation, not compulsory arbitration,
Right.
because the UNCLOS says if there is a reservation and compulsory arbitration cannot be used,
There's a
then there
conciliation
is
mechanism.
yeah, because the objective of UNCLOS was to settle all disputes that could happen. So that's the last really recourse, the compulsory conciliation. So that was our fallback position. And people are saying that I risked too much by saying that
We have this
Ituaba
fallback
is,
option.
yeah. But no, we had the backup. And
Right,
that
right.
backup proved to be effective. East Timor used it against Australia and won. And Australia uh, 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 followed the resolution, the decision of the Compulsory Conciliation Commission. So that was the situation. Uh, uh, I was sure we would win because if if China could claim the entire South China Sea, 85.7% under the 9 now 10 dash line, if the UNCLOS cannot apply to the South China Sea, then UNCLOS is dead. It cannot apply anywhere else in the world because everybody will say, India will say, oh, the Indian Ocean is ours. And Russia will say the Arctic Ocean is ours. The Sea of Azov is ours.
Yeah.
So the entire UNCLOS would collapse. And I said, all those judges in the tribunal, they studied UNCLOS from in college, masters, PhD. They practiced UNCLOS. They became uh, judges in tribunals of UNCLOS. They wouldn't allow UNCLOS to die.
Right.
They would never recognize that the South China Sea is an internal water of China. It's very obvious. It's covered by UNCLOS. So I said we can never lose here if we bring it on the UNCLOS
Right.
tribunal. But if we fight China on the water, they have the largest naval fleet now. They have huge Coast Guard vessels. We can never win. So I said we have to fight China the legal way because if we bring China to a legal forum, there is no way we can lose. But if we fight China at sea, we will lose.
Just for the purpose of some of the audience, because we throw out ideas, and perhaps they're not as familiar. Can you explain again what was the importance of the baselines law in terms of correcting the non-applicability of the Paris Treaty? Right, you cannot just put a square there.
Yeah.
It has to follow the shape of our
Yes.
archipelagic waters. Yeah.
Yes, we are an archipelago, and we were together with Indonesia. We advocated for the archipelagic doctrine, which was finally accepted under UNCLOS. In other words, under the archipelagic doctrine, we will draw baselines from the outermost island, enclosing the waters within the
Right.
archipelago. Before UNCLOS, our territorial sea would be only 12 nautical miles from
around each of the islands. So parang
around each.
porka that's
Yes,
siya.
and there
Exactly.
would be a huge area in the Sulu Sea that will be
International water.
waters.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond our territorial sea.
Right.
So we advocated for that, and but the archipelagic baselines must follow certain requirements. You cannot exceed the 100 nautical miles, except for 3% of your baselines. And we in I think 2 or 3 baselines we violated UNCLOS. We did not, so we had to correct it.
Right.
And that was the purpose of Republic Act 9522, to correct our baselines to conform perfectly with the UNCLOS.
Right.
That's why during the hearing at The Hague, the tribunals, one of the judges asked the Philippine lawyers, you're questioning China's 9-dash line as non-compliant with UNCLOS, but you have also
Exactly,
your
yeah.
baselines, you're following the Treaty of Paris lines. And the lawyers said, no, we have amended that. We have the Republic Act 9522, and here is the decision of the Supreme Court, precisely upholding that we are now totally compliant with UNCLOS. So we submitted that.
Justice, thank you very much for clarifying that. Of course, as we speak, the Philippine legislature, especially the Senate, was also finalizing further tweaks to our archipelagic waters and baselines. Can you also clarify why we had to do, after the 2009 baselines law, further tweaking and modifications?
Well, the House approved already the archipelagic baselines.
Right.
I mean, the Maritime Zones Act.
Exactly, yeah.
So we're claiming 200 nautical miles from our baselines because the baselines, we've established that in Republic Act 9522.
22,
So
yeah.
this bill now that has been approved by the House and pending in the Senate would now delineate the 200 nautical mile and claim that because of the UNCLOS ruling affirming our EEZ,
Yeah.
we have a full EEZ in the West Philippine Sea, and uh, I have suggested to the House that we put there reciprocity,
Right.
because right now, uh, when you exercise innocent passage in China's territorial sea, China said you have to inform us or get our consent
Right.
prior uh, notice to us that you are passing through, and or get our consent. So that's the minority view. The rest of the world, uh, maybe 95% of the coastal states of the world follow the majority view that when you exercise innocent passage in the territorial sea, you don't have to notify the coastal
Yeah.
state.
Meaning, diretso ka
Yeah,
lang,
diretso ka lang.
you're not doing anything
Yeah,
spying, you're not
yeah.
targeting
It's
anyone. Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
using you're passing through in a straight line. You don't zigzag.
Yeah.
You don't fish. It's just an innocent passage just
Right.
to pass
Diretso
through.
lang, yeah.
But China requires prior consent, prior notice. And I said, we follow the majority view that there is no need for prior notice or prior consent unless the ship of the state of that ship requires notice or prior consent. In other words, if you are like the Philippines, we don't require prior notice, prior consent. You can pass it.
Right.
But if your country, like China, requires us to give notice, you must also notify us. In other words, subject to reciprocity.
Though, of course, just we have this problem of the warships, passing and then turning off their
Yes,
electronic systems. I
yeah,
mean,
they turn off the automatic
right,
identification
exactly.
system. That's what the Chinese do. But then we will say that you have to turn on your
Right.
AIS
You
because
can pass, but it has to be turned on so
yeah,
we can see
yeah,
your
we can
straight
see, yeah.
movement. Yeah.
So hopefully, because China is the only country, I think, along with two or three others, that require foreign warships to secure consent or
I think it's like
prior.
Brazil, India, and Iran, if I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
mistaken, some of these
yeah.
countries, right? Yeah.
So, uh, in other words, they take advantage of us because
Yeah.
when they pass through our territorial sea, uh, they don't notify us. But when we pass through their territorial sea, they require
Yes.
us. So just make it reciprocal.
Reciprocal. Yeah. The baselines law was essentially to make sure our hands are clean
Yeah.
when we eventually take it to arbitration. Now that we won the arbitration, you have to further adjust because you have to affirm the maritime
Yeah.
rights that were affirmed in that,
Well,
right? So,
it's under UNCLOS, your right to your continental shelf, including your
right,
EEZ, uh, inheres or is inherent
right,
by the mere fact that you're a coastal state. By the mere fact that you're facing the sea, you automatically have the inherent right to maritime zones up to your extended continental shelf if you qualify, but definitely your EEZ. So you really don't need to pass a law. But you need to, because we are fighting China, this is one of our weapons to, to strengthen our position. Uh, we pass a law saying that, oh, we won this case, we have a full. It is a form of reiterating it to the world.
right,
But technically, once you are a member of UNCLOS, your right inheres.
right,
Uh, there is no need to make a formal declaration like passing a law. But it is good for purposes of reminding us
right,
and the rest of the world. And you can add there what you want. Like when you exercise innocent passage, it must be subject to reciprocity. That's the value
right.
of it. So,
So better spell it out and play
yeah,
safe in that sense,
yeah, okay.
Justice. Before I go to President Duterte, I just want to get your sense of President Aquino, the late President Aquino. From my understanding, there was also some hesitation in Malacanang at the beginning on this arbitration issue. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like, what is your understanding? Because if the president was not were not behind this arbitration move, the thing wouldn't have moved forward. What is your understanding of how President Aquino saw this issue?
Well, well, when China seized Scarborough Shoal in 2012, when ASEAN had the meeting with China, ASEAN plus China in Cambodia, the Chinese vice uh, premier told President Aquino, our Coast Guard vessels in Scarborough Shoal will stay there permanently.
So occupation,
Yeah.
yeah.
So when that was President Aquino had to make a decision because that's an invasion already.
Yeah.
That's territory because it's above water to high tide. It's land. So you are the president. Your first duty is to defend the territory of the Philippines. Without territory, you are not a state. So when he came back, he asked uh, Ambassador Del Rosario, "Where is that paper that you gave me?" Because
Uh,
before that,
right.
a year before that,
You were already making,
yeah, I
yeah.
met. I went to on a cold call. I went to see Ambassador Secretary Del Rosario. Then I said, "Let us bring China to an UNCLOS tribunal. We can do it. Here's the strategy." I gave him a
Right.
memo, and he said, "But if you don't believe me, you don't have to believe me. You go to you you consult the legal experts in Europe and in America if this can be done." And he consulted, and they told him it's doable. But when he went to President Aquino told him, "Why do you want us to sue China? China hasn't done anything at that time.
Right, right.
The incident in
That,
Scarborough didn't
yeah.
happen." So when
And also the Hong Kong
yes,
bus, yeah,
yeah.
all of that, yeah.
So, so it was shelved. Uh, but when the Chinese vice premier told President Aquino in Cambodia in December of 2011, our Coast Guard vessels will stay there permanently.
Yeah.
When they came back, he called the ambassador, the Secretary Del Rosario. "Where's that paper that you showed me that we can sue China? Let's sue China."
Yeah.
But we were prepared because Secretary Del Rosario had already consulted the American
Yes,
lawyers
right.
that it's doable. They prepared already the mechanism. That's why that was December 2011 when Aquino decided to sue.
2012.
2011.
2011.
2012, January 2012, one month later, we sued January. We filed it in January
2012,
2013. Yeah,
2012 to
2012. I'm
2013,
sorry.
yes, yeah.
So 2012, December, they came back from Cambodia and they decided to sue China. 1 month later, we already filed because the preparatory work was already done.
Right.
January
Ready to
2013.
launch na yun.
Yeah,
Ready
it
to
was
launch.
ready to
Yeah,
launch
I know,
already.
exactly.
So it was filed right away because 2 years earlier, I was talking already to Del Rosario that we can sue China.
Yeah.
And very wise move of his was to immediately talk to the Americans and the
Yeah.
Europeans if it was doable. And they said it's doable. So they
Yeah.
prepared also.
So you just had the president to
Pres-
actually now I better understand why President Aquino was so passionate in Cambodia, because he confronted Hun Sen,
Yes.
the leader of Cambodia, who obviously at China's behest was even blocking
Yes.
the very discussion of the South China Sea. And
They
there was a
turned off.
back.
They turned off the microphone.
Yes, exactly. It was very testy exchange, and I think all of this really convinced President Aquino. Well, wala tayong makukuha sa ASEAN. Essentially, it has been
Yeah.
co-opted by China, and China is gonna colonize this Philippine
And
territory.
remember, the President Aquino was the commander-in-chief of the military, and the AFP, he was the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines.
Right.
And the primary duty of the Armed Forces of the Philippines is to defend Philippine territory.
Yes.
And he would be remiss in his duty. He will be criticized if he doesn't do anything to recover Scarborough Shoal. And of course, how do you recover Scarborough Shoal when we did not have the naval asset
Right.
to retake Scarborough Shoal? The best thing was to sue China. And that was in accordance with UNCLOS because all disputes between states must be settled peacefully by negotiation, mediation, and finally by arbitration. So he actually followed the rule of law
Right.
because under the charter of the UN, all disputes between states must be settled peacefully by negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, prohibiting the use or threat of force. So we
Right.
could not.
Speaking of president, the commander-in-chief, his duties. Then you have Duterte. I mean, considering everything he was saying during the campaign period, considering all of the rumors of the nexus with Beijing or the China connection, we're shocked by how Duterte administration aggressively went for what they call soft landing, and at some point you had the president essentially shooting us in our own foot. How was that to you, considering how all of these years you were building up this arbitration, and the victory comes just a month or so into President Duterte's term in office?
Yes, it was really it was the worst of times during the
Yeah,
Duterte, because here we're fighting China, defending the West Philippine Sea, and Duterte was defending China,
lawyering for them.
lawyering for China. He was the agent of China. Early in his administration, he made a verbal order to the Navy: patrol only the territorial sea. Do not go beyond the territorial sea. That was publicized. And I asked the Navy, are you going to follow? We will ask him to put it in writing. If he doesn't put it in writing, we will continue to
Right.
patrol. And he never put it in writing, but he at the behest of China, he said, patrol only the territorial sea. That means
Essentially, yeah.
give the West Philippine Sea, our exclusive economic zone, to China. But the Constitution says the state shall protect its marine wealth in its exclusive economic
Right.
zone and reserve the wealth there exclusively for the benefit of Filipinos. Yet he said patrol only the territorial sea. And later on he said, I allowed China to fish in the in our exclusive economic zone. That's
Yeah,
terrible.
yeah, yeah.
He really violated the Constitution.
And you had exchanges with the president back then, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how did it go? You said you
Well,
had.
every time he does that, I would write, I would issue a statement saying,
Yeah.
you cannot do that. That's against the Constitution. You're the commander-in-chief. And he even said that, well, the Chinese are there in the spot list because if somebody tries to oust me, they will they will protect me. Imagine that the the commander-in-chief of armed forces, he's saying that China, the Chinese army, will protect me against my own armed forces.
Yeah.
Terrible. That is really terrible.
And I don't know. The good news, I could say, is at least you had adults in the room, in the sense that there was Secretary Lorenzana. I would say Secretary Locsin, for all of his,
Yes.
let's say, rambunctious tweets. There were many times there was, I would say, constructive intervention by the adults in the room. Because, I mean, I tend to separate Duterte and his statements and then what the DFA was doing in a lot of times, what the DND was doing a lot of times. How did you understand that? Was that like the Philippine state fighting for its own survival?
Yes, I mean, we have to thank our career officials
Right.
in the DFA for holding the fort, no? And
Yeah.
Lorenzana also
Right.
for stopping Duterte from terminating the VFA, because after terminating the VFA, he would terminate the Mutual Defense Treaty, because that's really the
The
objective
next
of
step,
China.
yeah.
Yeah, you know,
It was
Duterte
that bad, yeah. Just to remind people, yeah.
yeah. So here was your president who was doing uh, the wishes of China. You know, you have a president who told his people, "I love Xi Jinping. I simply love Xi Jinping." It's China, Russia, and the Philippines against the rest of the world. And remember, when he went to Beijing in a state dinner, he said, I am eternally indebted to China. Can you imagine that? And China is seizing our island territories, maritime zones, and he would say, I love Xi Jinping, I am eternally indebted to China. It was really the worst of times for us.
Speaking of worst of times, this, I think, sets a tone for our next episode, where we'll discuss the current administration, the Marcos Jr. administration, which for many, my understanding is, has been a pleasant surprise, at least on the West Philippine Sea issue. Thank you very much, Justice Carpio, for that really compressed but very compelling overview of our struggle in the West Philippine Sea, to set the tone for our next episode. Thank you very much,
Thank
Justice
you,
Carpio.
Richard. Thank you. Thank you to our viewers.
Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Haydarian, and this was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.